Delighted to welcome you to the first of our event series on loneliness and technology, hosted by the English Association. So this event tonight will be on public space and the geography of loneliness. My name is Dr. Jess Cotton. I'm a lecturer at Cardiff University in the School of English, Philosophy and Communications. If you have any questions about the series, please do drop me a line at cottonj1@cardiff.ac.uk. We've got an exciting schedule lined up for the spring, so I really do hope to see some of your faces again at another of these events. Firstly, I'd like to say that I'm hugely grateful to Becky, Dr. Rebecca Fisher, from the English Association for being so accommodating of this series and for making this event tonight possible. And also to Professor Kerry Sullivan at Cardiff, who has been so supportive of this project. And I think indeed the seminar series was probably her idea. So this special interest group, I will just kind of run through a little bit about kind of our aims and then the theme for this afternoon, and then I will hand over to our speakers. So kind of loneliness and technology has been set up to help us think about the challenges of living, teaching and working at a moment when we're physically and psychically far apart from one another. So it's really kind of designed to think about what this lonely kind of working and teaching means for higher education and how various fields have been adapting to these pressures and possibilities. Is one of my arguments that to go looking for loneliness, we have to transgress several intellectual boundaries, and that to look at archives that might have taken a bit of a lonely historical trajectory. Another of my arguments is that loneliness is not the opposite of community, but rather one of the forms that community can take. And indeed, that loneliness is not always simply a negative feeling, but it can also be a political emotion that galvanizes people towards the creation of new kinds of community. That it's important to think about how they merge in relation to one another, loneliness and community. Isolation, however, I think is the point where community breaks down. And so I think that isolation can be quite a dangerous state, as loneliness doesn't always have to be. It is hard to create a sense of community when we're in a state of isolation, when we're not in the same room as one another. I miss physical touch and face-to-face presence, and I'm sure you all do too. And though it can be easy to find the internet as a kind of solution to some of these problems, that it so easily provides us with a virtual fix, I think it's worth it certainly asking whether technology has a solution, or whether we should exercise a certain degree of skepticism about technology's solutions and the dangers of only ever being virtually in one another's presence. When I was thinking about ways of talking about loneliness, the first thing that struck me was the assumption that everyone had adequate private space to retreat to. That verb retreat says a lot, and that the natural space of retreat is the nuclear bourgeois family. It is not a surprise that feelings of loneliness have been exacerbated by a late capitalist order where privacy, family values, flexible working and commerce are elevated above the values of community and care. Responses to the pandemic have both taken for granted that private space is readily available and unproblematic and reinforced those assumptions. But I think I'm not alone in seeing the dependence on private space. And I want to extend here this idea of private space to the resources that are taken for granted in learning and working from home as potentially a failure of care and community. We all depend on public space, and the sign of a good government is the attention that it gives to public things, knowing that these public things, as the political theorist Bonnie Honig argues, are the locus of democracy. We need public things to make society work. The privacy effects of the pandemic that the pandemic has brought into view has tended to kind of overlook the importance of public space, I think. A withdrawal of investments in public things has been the knock-on effect of austerity. And without being at all scientific about this, I imagine there would be an interesting correlation between countries that invest in public infrastructure and countries that best handle the pandemic. So I want to tentatively suggest that the failure of public space might have something crucial to tell us about loneliness, that loneliness is a public as well as a private emotion. It's related not simply to the people that we have around us, the communities that we've made our own, but to the ways that our towns and cities are built to accommodate those chance and planned encounters, and that make for the richest kind of metropolitan life, and which have been the locus of dissident, cultural, political, and sexual communities in the 20th century. This place in which lonely subjects have made a community of their own. To think about these questions, I'm delighted to be joined today by three speakers who know far more about the subject than I do. Dr. Regan Cook, Dr. Matthew Ingleby, and Dr. Claire Risbeth. Dr. Regan Cook is lecturer and senior tutor in the School of English. Ask for everyone just to turn off, if it's possible, to turn off, to mute your mic while everyone is speaking. It will be easier. Great, thank you so much. So Regan is lecturer and a senior tutor in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London. He's also the director of Queen Mary's City Centre and Interdisciplinary Urban Research Group. His work focuses on matters of urban public space, collective culture, sociality and the representation and imagination. He is the co-editor of the Key Thinkers on City.
You've muted yourself, Jess.
Yes. Okay. Dr. Matthew Ingleby is lecturer in the School of English and Drama at Queen Mary University of London. He's the author of 19th century fiction and the production of Bloomsbury, novel Grounds, and Bloomsbury Beyond the Establishment. He serves on the editorial board of the London Journal and the advisory board of QMUL City Centre. His current book project addresses the way space becomes increasingly conceived as contestable in the mid-19th and early 20th century until 1945. The project focuses on rent contestations between landlords and tenants and the role of railings in producing exclusion in the city. And finally, Dr. Claire Risbeth, indeed, is a senior lecturer in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield. She has led research projects on social inclusion in public open space located in London, Sheffield, Berlin, and imminently in Beirut. The Bench project, which she will be showing in collaboration with the Young Foundation, emerged from her role in improving well-being through urban nature and with the implied remit of refugees welcome in parks. Her academic curiosity and social values are focused on profiles of marginalization shaped by intersections of ethnicity, class, and gender, and the importance of these informing the civic ambitions of public space. She's recently published both academic and professional facing outputs on refugee inclusion and well-being, young people, mental health, and nature connections, evaluating intercultural public space in Bradford and ethnographic understandings of ethnically neighbourhoods to inform urban design practice. So first up, Claire will introduce a film that I'm going to show that she's worked on, Alone Together, The Social Life of Benches. There'll be a screening of the film, then Regan will speak, and finally Matt will talk, and it will be followed by a discussion amongst the panelists, and then going on for 7:15, we will open the discussion up to questions. Please do post any questions in the chat function as you go, and Becky and I will try and get round to those. So I will share my screen with you now.
Hi, so I think just before you hit play, I'll just give you 1 minute intro to this film. I'm in a very fortunate position of allowing the film to really speak for myself. This is a film directed by Esther Johnson, who is part of our research team in 2015, who were looking at this idea of benches and what it means, not just to be in pass-through public space, but to spend time there. And we were interested in how people are seen as anti-social or excluded from public space, but also who are seen as positive lingerers, and what actually it means to sit outside and to spend time outside. So as Jess said, we worked in collaboration with the Young Foundation, also Greenwich Inclusion Project. There was myself as a landscape architect leading the team, and then with Esther and with Ben Regali, who is a geographer. So we were very interdisciplinary, and we used the film very much as a way of, for us, exploring what these two spaces meant for the people who lived nearby. So there are two sites in London. The sites were chosen by the team, but mostly by the two non-academic members of the team as ones that were local and important to them. And so I think we'll watch the film. It's about 18 minutes long, and then I'll maybe just give a few sentences after that, but I think it's nice to come to the film fairly fresh. Thank you.
त्यस्तो ठाउँ त कहाँ हुने पाएको हुन्न के नानी अब देख्न त अलिकति छेउछाउ भयो भने उही कुटो कोदाल गरेर किसान गर्न भन्छन् गयो वनमा राना वन घाँस दाउरा गर्यो आयो त्यही घरै त्यही पा घर आयो बस्यो के गर्ने घरमै खोल्नु भन्छन् वन पाका गए त्यही चौपारीमा बस्ने के घर आयो घरै पा
Well, my name's Lauren, and I'm visiting today because I usually come here because it's a nice square and it's a nice place to relax with my dogs, Storm and Diesel. It's a good place to get away from things and sit and think. I'm from Albania, and the tattoo I've got is the flag of Albania and the word Shqiptare, which means Albanian. Yeah. I'm proud of my heritage, and I'm also proud of my London heritage as well, and being brought up like a Cockney. Yeah. So I'm like a Woolwich Albanian.
Michael Grant, born in England, of Jamaican parents. What else do we say? Well, I'm here most days, not every day, but during the week, the atmosphere is a lot better than what it was a few years ago. A few years ago, it was just a little dingy little square. So I quite like the fact that it's quite open, and it's a lot more pleasant. They had huge trees. Remember the Old Testament. The Bible talk about, how can I put it? Take care of the cedars of Lebanon, because they were somehow the Almighty quite like the fact that He created the trees. I suppose they cut them down. I was hoping they wouldn't. I asked them, "Are you gonna?" They said no. and then it was gone. You know what I mean? I said, somebody was telling me a lot of porkies.
My name's Ali. My name's Fitz.
मेरो नाम छली कुमारी थापा म नेपालबाट आएको
You have to tell your name first.
My name is Esther. What's your name?
Esther. And yours?
She's Kushi.
I'm Margaret. Untitled, live in Winchcombe Road. And you're on St Helier open space. I must have been 4. My brother was coming up for a year and we moved in round the corner there, but nothing of this was here. The field was here and that was a field. It was very nice. I thought it was like heaven living out here after living in the middle of London, you know. Life was a lot different then.
My name's Wade, 22. I use this park as my local. I come down here just to get away from everyone, just practice my tricks. Basically been trying to practice my 360s, fakies, just all bits and pieces. Once you get the hang of it, then the layout was pretty fun. Bench.
Okay, my name's Philip. I've got bipolar. There's benches, there's benches, there's benches. Right, you'll have a look. People will go and use benches like all the time, and it's just, I think it is a social meeting point. You don't need a cafe or any. It's just a 5-minute. Oh, I'm gonna sit down, and it can sort your day out. You think, right, this is what you got to do, bang.
My name is Roy. I'm born in Trinidad and Tobago. I come here in this country just over 20 years.
People coming to shop, people coming to have coffee, people coming here to go pubs, people coming to watch telly.
Well, like us, you just come here to chill.
My man like he works in Woolwich, and we come and hang with friends, chill out, and that's it really. Isn't it? That's it. That's really I
If you
can say.
spend longer than a week in Woolwich, yeah, you will see so much stuff. You see everything. Don't like if it starts raining, yeah, I swear to God, you will choke on the rain.
Obviously, I'm not from around here. I live somewhere else. But when I come here, I all my friends. This is a meet point for us, and to meet up in it. Like he's from somewhere else. I'm from somewhere else. She lives somewhere else. Everyone lives somewhere else. Innit? But when we tell people to come Woolwich, they come Woolwich, innit? Like meet us here, innit? And that's why from here we chill. Then everywhere goes different ways, innit?
नेपालबाट आएको नेपालबाट कोही कोहीले त भन्छ क्या राम्रो चाहिँ मर्निङ मर्निङ भन्दै हिँड्छ हामी त्यही उनीहरू मर्निङ भने हामी त्यही भन्नु पर्ने होला भने त्यति भन्छ त्यही हो जानेको हामीले इङ्ग्लिस जानेको भने हामी साथी साथी भइहाल्थ्यौँ नि कस्तो मनपर्छ अब खै त छैन के कुरा नबुझेपछि के गर्ने अप्ठ्यारो छ त नानी न त कति राम्रो छ कति यहाँ त भाषा बिना पो रोएछौँ त हामी त
We just live nearby, so whenever I pass from here, she goes on here. Actually, it's good for her because she's got autism. So for us, it's really beneficial. She loves to, because of the sensory issue, she takes off her shoes. She likes to be on the grass. Yeah.
And that the circle thing, she liked to sit there. Yes, and she sits sometimes for on this bench for some time. No, I think outdoor is better with her. That makes them calm. So they love to be in a place like this.
My name is Owen James Watchon. I'm 12 years old. I come to the ramps like every day. And then before I go knock for all my friends, and then we go over the ramps and we have games of skate with each other. And it's just a fun place to go to skate.
There are some times I come here, probably about 4 or 5 times a week, and I'll come here from about 1 in the afternoon till about 5, 6 of an evening. And then there are some times that I'll come for once a week or once every 2 weeks, just for a couple of hours.
I come to the park maybe 4 times a week. I'll spend at least 4 hours in the park. Maybe have a couple of beers to drink and all, 6 o'clock, I'm gone.
My eyes are getting a bit dim, and I come out basically just because they say it's good for the eyes.
My name's Terry James. You know, my husband, who works in the field division in Penn, or did, would say that we are only as good as the light we're given. Disabled.
Has the sound gone off?
Nice.
Just enjoying the sun and watching everyone being happy, like, because when it's the summer holidays and the children are out playing, and you can tell everyone's having a good time, because of the water thing here, it's unusual for like a place that's right where a town centre is to have somewhere like this. It's almost like a getaway from the town.
When I first learned how to drop in on a scooter, because my friend Ben, he already knew how to do it, and he was trying to teach me. And then after I'd done it, I was so happy. It makes me feel happy because I'm out with my friends and I'm not indoors like stuck playing Xbox or stuff.
I like to ride in groups, but when no one else is around, I just like to zone myself out and then just do what I'm doing.
I like the way it's designed because it's almost like a theatre.
And they should get a remote for this TV.
Yeah, you can't hear it.
No, man, they always put the news on.
Yeah,
Why have they always got the news on?
Always BBC.
They should change it. Or you know what they should do? They should just have some big control.
Link up TV, bad boys, don't know, trust me. But it's like got camera, don't have to watch us, don't it?
Yeah, that's because you know the World Cup people was dashing shit at the TV when England was playing.
Because England lost it.
Yeah, lost against Germany.
They're always here, but I can understand that, and that's to show their presence here as well. And if they wasn't here, I think there'd be a lot more criminal behaviour. I know they're not the police, but they're in uniform and they make a difference just by being here.
They go until around 6 o'clock in the evenings, and then they bugger off home. And sometimes in the square, things kick off at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, and they're nothing about.
I've got good memories and bad memories. at being at this square. I've seen lots of physical fights, verbal fights, and I've also witnessed other good things, you know.
My friend found love, yeah, in Love Lane, innit? I'm not even lying, that's called Love Lane, you know that, innit? Only found out the other day, fam, that's called Love Lane, innit? And my friend met a girl at Tesco's, innit? Inside Tesco's, innit? So he's with her now, innit? So they found love in Love Lane, innit?
I was sitting over there one evening, and a couple of Christians came up to me and started talking to me. Anyway, at the end of the conversation, she said, because of the way I looked, she says, have you eaten yet? So I said, no. I got a bit of a porky. And she handed me a £20 note. I did my euro, the rest, and I was quite pleased that day.
अस्ति हामीले यहाँ देख्दा देख्दै अल्तार्यो हिममा चक्कुले हान्नु के घाममा त्यसैले हान्नु घाम घुममै आयो के उठेरै आए चुप्प लगे गुवार छिटो पान्छन् के गुवार पान्छन् बुढाबुढीले गुवार पान्छन् छिटो
I was once well off, let's put it that way, and in the late 80s I lost my money. So I know what it's like now to not to have a diggy bird in your pocket or any savings. You know what I mean? So I know what it's like to be struggling from day to day, day to day, day to day. And that's the reason why I do the lottery. And I can't see any other way out of my situation.
I'm so glad that they've never built on this because I thought they would, you know, I thought they'd build houses, but no, they never have done.
I don't want to make it more congested also because it's quite a nice open space.
It's better to be outside to just, you know, get fresh air and instead of sitting indoors watching TV, be more proactive.
Without benches, everyone will be a bit like more lost. They wouldn't talk as much. It's face to face, good old fashioned face to face chat.
Being out here in the park, you can actually feel a little bit more free.
It's nature. That's the only thing I can say. It's nature, and I like to look at nature.
दिनमा यसरी पार्कहरुमा हिँड्यो यताउति गरे हजारजना मान्छे देख्यो भने गति पर्छ गरे भन्थे के हाम्रो बाजे बराजुहरुको बुढापाकाको कुरा होला पनि अनि बाटोमा यस्तो भेट्यो यस्तो नराम्रो मान्छे आए पनि यस्तो चिन्ह पत्र भएर मुसुक हाल्यो त्यो मान्छे कति राम्रो हुन्छ के अहिले म यति नराम्रो छ है बोल्दा त राम्रो लाग्यो लाइन त होला लाचे लाचे नराम्रो छ भने छ बाबा छोरी त एला हो नि बाबा छोरी त एला हो
Thank you for showing that, Jess, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And I think there's kind of hopefully quite a lot of ideas we can take from that about what it means to be collective outdoors and the different ways in which people are together. One thing that we really drew from it was kind of how bench space can allow us both to be solitary in a kind of legitimate way, but also sociable, both, and allowing quite fluid friendship kind of groupings like those teenagers where people come and go in a different way than enclosed indoor space. I think another thing, just one final thing really, just to pick up on something Jess mentioned about this idea of retreat. And, you know, contexts like for many people living in Woolwich and many people living in St Heliers, they live quite tough lives. They're quite tricky. A lot of people have health problems. A lot of people are caring for other people. And the context of the home space is not always the retreat. So actually public space, though you are visible and you are collective, is actually also a retreat space for people, and actually really vital for many people. And obviously I could talk at length about things to do with the design of the space and how people interacted with that, but I think we'll leave that to the discussion. I mostly just wanted to share the film with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's really wonderful video, and it kind of segues very nicely into Reagan's paper, which is on stranger intimacies and kind of speaking about the city in this way. So I will hand over to Reagan.
Hi, everybody. Can you see my slides and hear me okay? Great. Okay. Well, Claire, thanks for a wonderful video, and thanks, Jess and everybody for being here tonight. The material I want to present tonight comes from a few different research projects I've done over the years, and a collaboration with a former doctoral student named Sam Miles. And we put our heads together recently to start thinking about some of the ways that people in today's cities form intimate relationships with unknown others, with people they don't know. And we called our paper Inviting the Stranger In, partly because it's about allowing unknown others into your personal space, into your life, and also because in many cases, it's not public space, but it's private space, the home and other private venues where intimate first contact or first meetings often take place. And this isn't an entirely new phenomenon, of course. For a very long time, people have brought unknown others into their homes for meals or for lodging or sex. But what's different today is that meetings between strangers are very frequently planned in advance, and they're facilitated by fairly new, sophisticated digital methods for scoping, selecting, verifying, and filtering out potential contacts. And I also would argue that digital technologies are multiplying the spaces and the times where people engage in dialogue and exchange. They're helping many people overcome cultural constraints, such as local cultural norms around meeting and intimacy, as well as different logistical barriers for meeting face-to-face or in public. And they're extending access and experiences of intimacy to much wider demographics than when these apps were first developed. And digitally mediated encounters seem to be moving from the niche increasingly into the mainstream. The point is not that urban inhabitants are necessarily becoming more or less comfortable in the presence of strangers, but rather that these new digitally mediated forms of connection do bring new possibilities for connection and social distancing that deserve to be explored. And I think the past 10 months has both accelerated and extended these trends in some unprecedented ways. So with contact among strangers increasingly becoming a matter of choice as much as it is chance, there comes a kind of unsettling of many of the boundaries between what we think of as the domestic and the urban, the public and the private, and a reconfiguration of a lot of longstanding conventions through which things like intimacy, trust, comfort among strangers gets negotiated. So what I want to do today are the 4 points on the screen. I want to briefly situate this concern with strangers and unknown others within a broad literature in urban studies and social theory. There's a long line of thinking that says the very essence of living in a city is to live in a world of strangers. And yet there's a tendency in a lot of this research, particularly in urban encounter, to completely neglect the actual day-to-day experiences, as well as the impacts of technological change. And then secondly, I want to briefly outline a few points on how these encounters are taking place. And I'll dip very quickly into two categories. The first is apps related to sex, dating, and I think I should say friendship there as well. Best known by apps like Tinder and Grindr, but proliferating into several dozen. And then secondly, apps and platforms sometimes grouped under the umbrella of the sharing economy or peer-to-peer networks that bring people together, sometimes commercially, many times not, for things like accommodation, transportation, entertainment, socializing. Thirdly, then, I'm going to offer a brief conceptualization of stranger intimacy as a conditional relationship of openness towards the unacquainted. And this marks a distinction from the ways that strangers are often construed as others in discourses of urban or national belonging. And instead, what I'm drawing to with this conceptualization here is the way and the practices through which encounters with unknown others are valued and actively pursued for different purposes. And then very lastly, I won't go into depth, but I'll point to some principles for further research that I'm calling on my fellow geographers and others to pick up in their own investigations. And I'll use that as a way of concluding. So the concern or the topic of stranger relations, I think most foundationally it owes to the work of Jörg Simmel, who most famously described the intense bombardment of external stimuli, bodies, objects, effects that have to be dealt with as part of the urban everyday. The challenges of coping and calculating all this stimulus is what accounts for the calculating mindset of the urban inhabitant. But elsewhere, Simmel distinguishes the stranger as a particular form of interaction. It's one where someone goes from being an anonymous other to someone who has to be calculated in terms of their belonging, whether they deserve, I suppose, to be included or excluded, and whether forms of attachment or detachment are made. So it's a specific form of calculation that we have to make with an unknown other when they become a stranger. The ambivalence of living in a world of strangers before and after Simmel has been a long-running theme in sociology, cultural studies. And one key theme has been to question the ways in which, has been to question the extent to which a world of strangers diminishes social ties or leading to alienation and insecurity, or whether it multiplies possibilities. Now, Richard Sennett argued that by the middle of the 18th century, it was widely accepted that experience gained in the company of strangers was crucial to the formation of individual personalities. That is, if we didn't have encounters with strangers, we might be too inexperienced, too naive to even survive in the city. And his work, in a lot of ways, parallels Jürgen Habermas, who argued and demonstrated how interactions among strangers were constitutive of new public geographies in the city. And I think notably, both of these authors draw attention to both domestic and private commercial spaces as being crucial to the development of private reason. Now, both of their accounts are sometimes used quite pessimistically to argue for the kind of decline of public life over the 20th century, but they're also picked up in different ways in more affirmative theorizations of the world as the city as a world of strangers, or urban life affirmatively as the being together of strangers, as Iris Marion Young so cogently argued. And here the enchanting possibilities of encounter, the opportunities for learning, are positioned as a reason to celebrate life among strangers. Now, this ambivalence is picked up by Zygmunt Bauman, who extends Simmel to say that in postmodernity, the stranger is not necessarily even a threat to social order. It's a reminder of the differences that should be celebrated, protected, preserved. And then finally, just to say that Sarah Achman has questioned this. She sees the relationality of the stranger not as something that we do spontaneously, but it's one that's mediated by prior histories of subjugation, racialized and embodied difference. And she emphasizes that stranger danger is an underlying force that underpins the rejection of multiculturalism, the spread of xenophobia. But at the same time, Ahmed finds opportunities in these new spaces where differences do coexist and where people pursue intimacy of various kinds. Now, within my field of geography, the ideas of encounter and urban relatedness formed something of a kind of cosmopolitan turn over the last decade or so, where urban togetherness was both re-theorized, revalorized, and lots of social scientists have been out examining, marketplaces and bus stops and benches and sites of encounter to kind of highlight some of the ambivalences and possibilities that these contain. I think most recently, Helen Wilson has summarized these very nicely in her paper on encounter, which argues that we now recognize that encounters are a mixed bag of possible emotions. And yet in her and other work, there's still a tendency to suggest that these are primarily spontaneous, they're undesigned, they're by choice. And I think this contradicts, at least in our research, the way many encounters seem to happen. That is, in the broad literature on an encounter, there's scarcely a mention of digital technology, and that seems to get siloed into other discussions, other conversations, where the digital is somehow seen as disconnected from the physical or the actual. And so what I want to do now, just really briefly then, is to turn to think about some of the ways that digital technology does reconfigure these relationships. And so the first example I want to give are online sex and dating apps. These are platforms where people go looking for love or friendship or casual hookups. And it's important to acknowledge right away that intimate encounters have been mediated for a very long time. In the 18th century, there were Lonely Hearts newspaper ads. In the 1930s already, you could call telephone hotlines, for example. Desktop-based dating has been around for at least 40 years. But what's different about digital technology is the ways that it's increasingly portable. We can do it, at any time, anywhere, that the potential for encounters has been spatially and temporally extended, and that it really does intensify at least the possibility of intimate connection, whether that's, online or in physical proximity. And they're extremely popular. Tinder on any given day has something like 60 million people logging in. Grindr for gay men has something like nearly 4 million users every single day. Gay men, in fact, seem to have led, Grindr was kind of the original hookup or socialization app, but its uses and the practice more generally has become widespread and incredibly global. I've talked about some of the kind of distinctive features. I think a few things to perhaps emphasize are this intensification of intimate possibilities. So not only are we constantly connected and be having these kind of intimate encounters, whether we're in our beds or in our homes or on the toilet or on the way somewhere, but there are lots of ways to kind of have that initial encounter. So you don't have to physically walk up to a stranger. You can, at the very minimum, give someone a wave or a woof or a nudge or a tap. And then, this gives a kind of a ticket to conversation, Harvey Sachs called it, or what Goffman called impression management. The risks of this become much, much lower for many people. It's quick, it's casual, it's playful, and the risk ultimately is quite low. Another thing that's worth mentioning is just how sophisticated these are in allowing people to scope, verify, and filter. So far more efficiency than you could find, for example, in even the busiest of nightclubs or singles bars or crowded city spaces. However, the sense of immediacy that these apps can bring has paradoxical qualities, of course, that people often then find these to be the most frustrating apps on their phone, that they're a waste of time. There's a survey that says, on Grindr, less than 5% of conversations actually result in some kind of meeting. And these apps are often the ones that people say are the least like ones on their phone. They're deleted and downloaded and deleted again. Another thing that I think worth mentioning is that over the past 5 years, these apps have contributed to a discourse where the phrase Netflix and chill, the idea that you would have someone over for a movie, and then perhaps the conversation extends into more intimate terrain or not, really I think speaks to the ways in which these apps do facilitate private meetings in the first instance. So there's less the need to go to, say, a place where you would typically meet singles. It can be done in relative privacy, relative comfort. Some people say relative laziness. Just to keep moving very quickly, I think there are lots of critical questions that these raise, not only about the downsides personally to using these apps, but questions about what these do for wider collective cultures of sociality, friendship, and dating. Could get more into that, but I think for now, that's enough on sex and dating. The second example I wanted to give very briefly are sharing economy or peer-to-peer platforms. These are basically mechanisms through which conventionally private spaces get opened up to wider, either peer-to-peer or public, conditionally public audiences, you might say. They provide a way that people can share and give access and even monetize resources like their living room or like a car or like an entertainment space or a meetup group. These are peer-to-peer exchanges that sidestep many conventional institutions. They're seen generally as mutually beneficial and good value, except for, of course, when they feed into corporate platforms such as Airbnb. But something that I think they do share, at least for many users, is kind of novel possibilities for sociality, for connection, for meaningful experiences. Now, they do very often require certain kinds of processes. So one of those is de-strangering, that is to let someone into your home or into your car. At least initially, there's a breaking down of boundaries. You have to establish a little bit of common ground, a little bit of shared expectation. And these are forms of exchange with unknown others that for some people are very extraordinary. They don't happen in a typical day-to-day, but I think the ubiquity of these apps, the ordinariness of them, means that for lots of people, de-strangering or entering into places that even a decade ago would have seemed quite unusual have really become the norm. The other thing I think worth mentioning is that these are facilitating new forms of trust among strangers that sidestep conventional institutions. So the fact that we have things like feedback systems, rating systems, credit card payment, does mean you find people feeling very comfortable doing things that would have seemed perhaps strange or risky a decade ago. Now, again, like sex and dating apps, these raise lots of questions, both about sort of individual subjective experiences, the extent to which we're monetizing our sociability, our private spaces, and then also collective effects about both platform capitalism, as it's sometimes called, as being certainly wrapped up in new forms of exploitation, undermining conventional institutions. So what I'm not doing here is positioning these in a celebratory way, but simply trying to outline some of the contours through which these two kind of mediums really are brokering a large numbers of conversations and contacts and more intimate kinds of encounters, particularly on people who are living highly mobile, highly international lives, people who are new in a city or in a context, or potentially we can discuss people dealing with loneliness or needing to make new friends, new contexts. Now, what we've done in the paper is offered a conceptualization that we think unifies these kinds of interactions and we hope outlines a pathway towards further research. So we're calling this stranger intimacy as a concept for thinking about these relationships where people are open towards the unacquainted, and for researching the kinds of qualities and intensities that these interactions can entail. And so we're following with Lauren Berlant here, who sees intimacy as an epistemological frame, right? It's openness and connection beyond your own networks, beyond the institutions of work, school, community, to think about places and times where we do participate in acts of sharing, caring, providing, and more. Stranger intimacy often describes giving moments where we give our self, our body, our personal space over to people that fall outside of existing networks. And then part of that is a willingness to at least be open or to engage in practices where we share meaningful stories, experiences, and inner feelings. The stranger intimacy can be an openness of the self and personal space, but it can also include, giving access to resources, a place to hang out, to sleep, a seat in your car, a space in your kitchen, even the keys to your house in some cases. Sometimes these are motivated by romance or sexual pursuits, an ethic of care or hospitality. And of course, sometimes these are very much about building networks or about making or saving money. In our research, what we found is that they often involve quite complex entanglements, right? That people say, well, it's partly social, it's partly psychological, and it's partly economic, right? That people have multiple reasons for doing these things that can't easily be untangled. I guess one last thing to say here is that these planned or face-to-face encounters are often marked with a particularly kind of intensity, that they're emotionally intense forms of encounter. The interactions can be awkward, they can involve lots of tension, they can be uneasy, or they can be embarrassment. These are sometimes anxieties that are compounded by the worry that you could be trapped in this encounter for an uncomfortably long time. But on the other hand, there's a lot of research that shows that people in these situations can become much closer, much faster, be much more open in a relatively short period of time. I think most of us can recall a conversation with a stranger where we were remarkably open or candid about our lives. And I think there's a lot of research that gathers people saying similar kinds of things. And partly that's, I think, being in a proximate space with someone who is disconnected from your networks does open up oneself to these kinds of emotionally intense encounters. I think very quickly, echoing back to Simmel's observation on public encounter, it's possible to discern how technological change is contributing or driving ambiguous new home city geographies in which sharing private space does become relatively normal, routine, and routinely calculated. But with that comes what some people are calling unhoming, the idea that our home is given over to market forces, market logics, and some of the emotional comfort that's traditionally associated with private domestic space is arguably being reworked or reconfigured in ways that I think we really have yet to sort of adequately research. With these points in mind, then, I just wanted to draw to a close what we have outlined in our paper as just some of the things that we think social researchers should foreground in any further research into stranger intimacy. And so one of the things that I argue that I think as we start to think more about the kinds of relationships that we're brokering here is that we need to be avowedly open-ended and attuned to the details of practice. Now, this principle sounds a little bit like a truism for any social research, but I think new technology often generates a discourse that oscillates between the celebration of possibility and then laments for more traditional ways of living that are being lost. This is certainly true, for example, in sex and dating. There's laments about, that the apps are ruining everything and diminishing many old ways that people used to socialize. But the research on this shows a much more ambivalent landscape. It shows that, particularly among gay men, these have been very important ways that information is exchanged, that people feel comfortable, with their own sexuality, learning about, risks and harms, and really acclimating themselves to a new kind of world. That's just a small example, but the point is that there's lots of different research showing that the results and effects of these, both individually and collectively, are much more open-minded than I think initial discourse tends to presume. The second point for further research is that we have to be, critically attuned to some of the ways that these apps really do reinscribe and exaggerate existing hierarchies, inequalities, discriminations, based on different sort of identity categories, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, really do permeate these platforms, both the sex and dating apps and the sharing economy. And there's lots of research that backs up some of the ways that these can be really toxic. But the point I would add on there is that these differences do need to be critically examined and they shouldn't be assumed. And that's backed by a lot of emerging research that shows, for example, the ways that Syrian refugees crossing Europe have had extremely positive experiences in some cases using apps, the ways that people across sub-Saharan Africa are finding work and travel connections through them, or research that shows international domestic service workers, for example, tend to be very reliant on both forms of these apps. I'm glossing through that very quickly, but the point is we need to be open-ended, but we also need to not assume that the way that these apps go from the margins into the mainstream means that they really are opening up possibilities and new inequalities that need to be examined. And then my very last point on this would just be to say that these new technologies interact with social and economic lodges in some really dynamic ways. The technology changes the culture, and the culture drives the technology in ways that are difficult to untangle. Now, we've approached this in our own research primarily ethnographically, and we think more of that's needed, but we also need more than ethnographic understandings to make sense of these relationships. So we've been thinking, for example, in our own work about the ways that nightlife venues generally and LGBTQ spaces specifically are tied up in these changes. So what's the correlation, for example, between the decline of physical nightlife spaces, even pre-COVID, and the rise in popularity of apps that sidestep them? We're also thinking about correlations between platforms such as Airbnb and patterns of gentrification, or the ways that quantitative and GIS approaches might help us make use of available user data to visualize and more systematically analyze patterns of app and platform use. And we think these are going to be really crucial to not only understanding the cultures that these are driving, but to think about policy debates and interventions that might effectively mitigate against some of the collective harms that these are causing. So to draw this to a close then, I think questions of how unknown others, how strangers live and relate have long been central to social and urban theory. And it's a shame really that we've yet to pull digital technology into this. So that's what we're trying to do in this research. And I think it's striking, going back to Simmel, that his work was primarily, fundamentally about the ways that new technologies of industry, railway, timekeeping changed interpersonal dynamics. So I think it's in Simmel's spirit that we take these things seriously and think about what's gained and what we lose in the process. And then finally, it's just my hope that as we start to understand stranger intimacies, we might be able to help inform the making of better apps and platforms. And I think there's some promising examples of that already. There might be more effective forms of regulation or policy intervention when needed. Finally, that we as users might become more proficient, both individually and as parts of communities using these apps. And the hope then, to take us back to the topic of loneliness tonight, is that ideally or hopefully that we might, through digital technology, find new ways of developing more meaningful, mutually beneficial connections with others. And I think after the last 10 months, that'll be something that all of us will be looking forward to. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regan. And now I will pass on to Matt, who's going to be speaking about railings and the political geography of loneliness, I believe.
Can I just get some confirmation that you're seeing what I'm seeing?
Yeah, I can see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Just trying to get hold of. Wait. I want to see that. Does anyone know the way to get it big?
Yeah, in the bottom right corner, Matt, there's like a projector stand.
I'm used to like going up to the top of the thing, but it's
bottom right, I think.
Right. It's just Zoom is covering it.
Oh, you're very close to it.
Okay. It's covered by you, Regan. There we go. Right. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for this, Jess. It's really interesting. And bouncing off Regan's account of this very specific technology that some of us know very well, and others it seems quite exotic and alien. I'm going back in time a bit to a couple of other technologies, broadly speaking, that I would say are from the 19th century, and they have a kind of residual power within our society despite coming from the 19th century, and a power that I think has become rather enhanced and kind of resurgent in recent lockdown times that I'm kind of interested in exploring with you towards the end of this paper. One of them is railings and the other is the bourgeois home. Railings play an important role in defining the spaces, public or private, that we share and contest in cities, likewise in training the kinds of subjectivities these spaces help constitute. From their heyday in the 19th century, when the cheapening of the production of cast iron made them proliferate in our city streets and squares, railings have enforced, and because of their pervasive near invisibility, they're part of the furniture, they naturalize urban divisions. They're part of the material infrastructure of exclusion, which is in collusion with, but also itself productive of, ideologies that sustain our economic system, not least of which is our primal attachment to property rights, with a related social hygienism attendant upon bourgeois domestic space. Classically surrounding London's private garden squares, railings often have a very specific role to enforce the social segregation of children, attempting to secure from contamination thereby that key breeding ground of social reproduction, that is, the inner life of the middle-class child. All of which is to say that to think about railings is to think about the kinds of social alienation we suffer in capitalism. They're spear-like heads which warn off the self-impalings of those who are perilously reckless of their lesson of deterrence, These point to a wider symbolic violence railings perform that help enable our city's aggressive repression of the amatory, the friendly, the connective, the trusting. Railings tell us to see the stranger as a potential threat rather than a brother or a sister, an ally or a lover. And railings are therefore a technology of loneliness. They help produce the city as a space of loneliness in which each Englishman must retreat to his castle. A film from 1940 that's remarkably interested in the social function of railings, Thorold Dickinson's Gaslight, based on Patrick Hamilton's play from 1938, is better known for the way it depicts an insidious form of psychological abuse performed upon a woman isolated and made ripe for manipulation within that putatively Englishman's castle. And actually in the film, the gaslighter has a suspicious European edge to his English accent and conceals a German-sounding real surname, Bauer. This film can be seen as an analysis of the insidious rise of fascism. But it also joins a radical anti-railings tradition within British culture that stretched back to include John Ruskin, William Morris, in drawing attention to and opposing London's railings because of the material inequality they enforce, a tradition that culminated in George Orwell's passionate polemic against the return of railings just a few years after this film in 1944. So appearing at precisely the moment when London's cast iron railings around its private squares became removed, supposedly to be melted down for reuse in ammunitions as part of the war effort, and also when middle-class women were being led out of their homes into the public sphere through actual, not symbolic, war work, the film asks us to spot a kind of fascism lurking in railings, part of the unyielding material infrastructure of Victorian normalcy, which chimes with the domestic fascism of the gaslighter, the more infamous and human agent of social division within the film, who uses the isolation of heteronormative bourgeois privacy as a means of coercively controlling an individual through making them doubt their own perception of the space they know as home. The concept of gaslighting has received a lot of traction of late, being used extensively to describe the behaviour of unpleasant male reality TV stars in its recent iterations. It tends to be used in a non-spatial way to describe a kind of systematic, intentional, yet unacknowledged revisionism on the part of an abuser within the archive of shared memories of a given relationship, its events and discourse, in order to heighten and exploit an abusive power dynamic. But it's worth remembering the material, spatial origins of the term in a film that is about how domestic abuse can gradually turn a home into a place of torment. The play from 1938, which had recently revived successfully in various places, is suffocatingly claustrophobic, and intentionally so, just set as it is within the house in Angel Street, as the play was called in America. So the viewer has the monotonous sense of being stuck somewhere, like the victim of gaslighting herself. The film, however, expands the spatial representation of the original and has the female character at one point leave the house for a visit to the square's gardens, wherein she meets the retired detective, who turns out to be her savior. I was talking about Freud earlier on today. I'm going to play you a little bit of the film here. So this is 6 minutes of this really interesting scene where the gaslit, abused woman goes to the garden square.
I'm very pleasant. Look at that, charming there.
Matt, we can't see it.
Oh, really? Oh, God. Okay. Why is that then? Okay. Anyone got any ideas why that could be? So it
One
says,
of them, Matt, is maybe go back into presenter view. That might help.
am I not in presenter view?
You need to change the screen that you're sharing from to the presumably into the website screen as opposed to the PowerPoint screen.
Ah, okay. Thanks, Abby. So if I get rid of, okay.
You need to unshare your screen and then reshare it, but to the tab that is if you're viewing this through Google Chrome, you need to share the Google Chrome one instead.
Got it. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, sorry about that, guys. As you know from my paper, I'm more au fait with 19th century technologies.
I wonder how that happened, eh? Oh, my dear lady.
I'm all right, thank you. Where's my little dog?
Oh, savages, I hope you're not hurt, Mom.
No, not a bit.
Oh, you come and sit down over here.
Oh, no, I'm all right.
Oh, you can't possibly tell if you're hurt until you've had time to think it over. Doesn't matter so much when you've soft bones like those little rascals. Oh, wouldn't mind to go and complain to the
Oh, it
nurses.
wasn't their fault. It was quite a... Oh, thank you. That is kind of you.
Fond of children, I see. Got any of your own?
No. Let's go.
Well, you haven't counted all your bones yet. No, don't worry about me. I'm old enough to be a father. They're not what they used to be.
What?
Children. I should be ashamed if I couldn't bowl a better hoop than that, wouldn't you?
I never bothered about hoops. I was brought up in the country.
So was I. Whereabouts?
Devonshire.
Devonshire? What part?
I lived with some cousins near Exmouth.
I know Exmouth very well. Wonder if I've met them.
Their name was Ullswater.
Well, don't go yet. I was just getting interested.
Wait, what? Are you really, Carla? Stop it, you ruthless boys. It's disgraceful. Oh, how dare you!
Poor little devils. I'd like to give them a taste of Devonshire.
Yes, a grass bank to roll down in some nice clean mud. Well, thank you for being so kind.
Toy shop.
I beg your pardon.
Something those little objects to play with. There is a toy shop across the road.
Oh, what a lovely idea. They do look so miserable.
Well, you'll have to come along too, of course. I mean, that's the whole idea. Must have a woman about where brats are concerned, you know. I mean, they'd run a mile if I were to so much as call to them to come.
I'd love to see them enjoy themselves, but...
Well, what's to stop you?
My husband is out and he won't be back till tea time.
Then you'll be back in time to have it with him.
I don't want to be silly, but I don't know you.
Oh, this is charity, ma'am. That blows convention out of the window. Hey! Yes, I mean you children out there in the street. Come along, don't be afraid. I've got something for you.
Like some toys to play with. It is such a shame you can't go into the square. This gentleman thought that...
Well, there's a toy shop over there. Tops, if you like, or hoops.
You let's go across, shall we?
Oh, we've come to the wrong shop. It's an ice cream or what they want.
Do you think we should?
Nonsense. Make them all sick. Do them a world of good. Well, you know what you want, don't you? Come on in. Here we are. Help yourselves. Lovely. Look at them lovely clouds. Plenty more. Anything you like in reason. That's right. There.
And what exactly can we do for you?
Knock his block off. You, who cannot control yourself in your own home. To risk such a thing with a complete stranger.
It's the children.
A horde of noisy street urchins. When you know the only hope for you is rest and quiet. Put the dog down. You're not listening to me.
I am listening. What are you going to do?
I told you before, I can't stand the dog in the drawing room.
I'm very fond of her, Paul.
It's not natural. Fuss you make over it. Sometimes I wonder if you even want to be like other people.
Why did you ever marry me, Paul?
When I married you, Bella, you were a normal woman. So I thought.
It's only since we came to this house that I've changed. I never wanted to come here. Yet it was my money that made it possible for you to buy it. Is that why you married me, Paul?
You have changed, Bella.
What's made me change? What's made you change, Paul? Because you have in the way you treat me. I believe it's ever since that day when I found that old envelope addressed to Louis Bauer. That was the first time that you were angry with me like this.
Bella, I told you I had forgotten that incident. My only anxiety has always been to get you well.
I must get away from here. I'll never be well till I get away from this house, just
Come outside, Judy.
Paul, I could.
Okay, thank you. You still hearing me, yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
So Gaslight the play shows how the isolation of women in particular within the home leaves them vulnerable to psychological abuse. Hamilton's play, his script, which remained in that home with the abused party throughout, was clearly anti-domestic, on the brink of what, in socioeconomic terms, was the last gasp of that very slow-dying long 19th century. And it serves as a kind of deconstruction or even a bomb beneath the Victorian domestic ideology with its dangerous myth, particularly for women again, that the home was the antidote to, rather than, in many cases, a chief source of alienation. In Dickens's film, the addition of this scene in which the victim walks around outside might first seem to dilute that incendiary anti-domestic message. But when we look at its use of railings, we can see that the film's argument about the geography and politics of isolation and its associated mental health problems is importantly complicated by exploring the home's hinterland and the street furniture that helps police it. As the film progresses, key shots from behind the area railings onto the pavement render the home a kind of prison from which the extensive scene we've watched exemplifies a kind of day release. Bella's walk in and out of the railed-in space and her extraordinary encounters with those beyond the pale working class children opens her up to the possibility of other ways of engaging with the spaces she inhabits and other ways of conceiving herself. Bella is allowed to go for a walk in the private gardens on her own mind only because the railings act as a chaperone in lieu of her husband's panoptical eye, or are meant to. The railings are meant to guarantee she will not talk to inquisitive strangers or encounter difference. And it's only because of the orchestrations of the figure of the benevolent retired detective within this highly regulated bourgeois space of the private gardens that she makes any contact with the social world beyond the railings, and so sees herself briefly as an agent, and importantly an agent of care, no less, not merely a passive patient. Granted, there is a clear conservative maternity fetishism here that's muddying the waters, lurking in the lingering shots of the babies in prams, but Bella's not the only one who cares for those outside her ken when given a chance. The retired detective here, who helps Bella escape or transcend or see beyond the railings, acts voluntarily out of care as much as curiosity. Consider the gloomy faces of the poor children looking through the railings into the square to which they are denied access. They echo Bella's mental state, and they invite us to see that the psychological perils of domestic isolation are related to the unequal distribution of care and space more broadly in society at large. And Punch and Judy show Bella witnesses from the window, once back in the house, which the bourgeois children in the square have to lean over the railings to get an eyeful of. All of this kind of social happenstance that occurs in unrailed public space, the film suggests, enables victims of domestic abuse to compare their own experience with, and moreover, even to care for others. And in so doing, it undermines the monolithic power of the abuser, who tries to monopolize what masquerades for care, and who divides to rule. The context for understanding this film at the end of the long 19th century is really the emergence of a welfare state, which both the end of the railings, which led to a transfer into public ownership of much of London's green space, but also a welfare provision that would actually finally put the nails in the coffin of the kind of Victorian domestic ideology that had trapped the woman in the home for economic reasons. Those are the context for understanding this film's interest in railings and how it's connecting it to domestic abuse. But what might this film say to us now? I just want to say this very quickly before finishing. In March 2020, firstly, I want to say when I say now, I really am talking about now as a moment of COVID, which and lockdown, not now in Reagan's more expansive term, which is this world of the digital. And we might want to think about those two nows in our conversation. So what does this film say to us now in lockdown? In March 2020, this very 19th century technology of railings really became again very relevant for everyday life, and because of the parks that are surrounded by railings, notably Victoria Park in East London, but also Brockwell Park near Brixton, were much easier to shut down than, for example, commons, which are not surrounded by railings, such as Hampstead Heath, in lockdown's most extreme initial iteration, when councils were aided by police officers and closed down rare green spaces in areas of high population density for fear of virus spread, notwithstanding the enormous other social and health consequences of doing this. Domestic abuse since lockdown has been rampant, and more broadly, the mental health issues and substance abuse associated with domestic isolation, which are often concomitant with physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, have hugely increased. Interestingly, the Red Benches movement in Australia draws angry attention to the respite public space provides victims of domestic abuse, a respite that lockdown has made much harder to secure. One of the most profoundly devastating aspects of lockdown, I think, that we might have to reckon with in our culture for many years to come, I'm of a slightly more pessimistic frame of mind than I think Reagan, from what he said at the end, is the way it's produced a culture of radically reduced possibility for the kinds of ubiquitous everyday care that arises from social happenstance. Sure, much of the discourse about lockdown has trumpeted the way mutual aid societies semi-spontaneously arose in early lockdown days. But most care is so everyday, and starting with basic, almost genuinely mutual interactions in the street or other public places, it normally just happens without even the participants knowing it, realizing it is care. And this has simply gone for many people at the edges of society who may, like Bella, have been somewhat visible before lockdown, but have now simply disappeared from view entirely. The ideology railings helps produce misrepresents the stranger in the city as primarily a threat and mythologizes the home as a place of safety. In our pandemic times, this misrepresentation has been ramped up immensely. Strangers in the city of 2001 are represented all too often as little more than unconscious vectors of infection. So the material practice of living with others in a city challenges stranger danger ideology. However, and in so doing undermines the power of those who seek to exploit such fears, be they individual abusers, such as those depicted in Gaslight, or those who continue to thrive upon the politics and discourse of social division and social hygienism in society at large. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Matt. And it's kind of brought us to a really kind of interesting conclusion. And I'd love to kind of open a few kind of questions up to our panelists on this question, these two nows. I mean, two things that I kind of really struck me was the way that we were going kind of full circle back into this kind of into the kind of video about the benches, both for two reasons, which is like the surveillance that's always kind of on the outside or kind of in the inside or kind of lurking around this kind of potential for this kind of these meetings, and the kind of the idea that kind of Matt finished on, which was the relationship between happenstance and care, the kind of the possibilities of care that happen within the dynamics of social space, and of course to kind of speak back to Reagan's paper, the ways in which kind of, I suppose that I think Reagan, you had that kind of that metaphor of unhoming, and actually there is a kind of the strangeness about technology is that it kind of can overdetermine those encounters, it can reduce them, but of course it is generating kind of strangeness as well. So I just wondered if I could kind of open by, or kind of close by directing any kind of comments on these two questions about happenstance and surveillance and the ability to kind of reclaim this public space. You know, I suppose, what do we need to put in place if this question of loneliness is very much kind of pinned to this question of public space? What do we need to kind of to foreground?
Well, I've got a kind of provocation that I want to kind of ask Reagan about, and it's kind of about the idea of digitally mediated encounters being equivalents of social happenstance. And it's interesting what you were saying about the kind of removal of risk that these kind of platforms enable. And I was kind of, maybe there's yeah, a kind of problematic kind of idealization of risk that is somewhere in my imagination. But it strikes me that an encounter that has already, in a sense, been through a kind of a surveillance filter necessarily neutralizes the possibility of emancipation or utopian kind of meaning that intimacy can have, and that might account for people's kind of really love-hate relationship with these apps, because the promise of their kind of utopian kind of connectedness is very often belied by a reality of quite a transactional experience.
Yeah, I'm really kind of ambivalent about this, and that was backed up in a lot of the research that Sam and I were doing specifically with gay men using apps and talking about their relationship to physical spaces, you know, gay bars and cruising sites and things. And I don't want to overplay the generational divide, but what was interesting was to hear older men talk a lot about nostalgia for the chance encounter of cruising and how nice it used to be able to walk up to a stranger in a bar and just have a chat, versus in general younger people who talked about how creeped out they felt or how awkward it could be when someone approached them. And, you know, I remember one guy saying, well, if I was looking for sex or wanted to be flirty, I'd be on my phone. And the sort of inverse for that, I think, and I don't know, you know, how women of different ages would feel, but it seemed, you know, again, being slightly more affirmative about this, it seemed to some extent the reduced risk of happenstance seemed to make some people feel a bit more comfortable, that like you could go out and it could be very clear, you know, I'm not looking for sex, or I'm not looking not looking to encounter. And the idea of cruising to a lot of younger people just sounded horrendous to some, and in a way that I think it's because it's not even legible, it's not even happening. It's very hard to imagine the benefits that are written about so affirmatively by someone like Delancey, or somebody who just privileges, or, really valorizes these. But on the other hand, people of all ages, particularly older men, did at the same time they're telling these quite pessimistic laments for what we've lost. When you started talking about, well, tell me about your experiences, your encounters, all of them could tell numerous stories where they'd met somebody and had a brilliant night, or they'd had a friend that they'd met once and it didn't work out, but they're still friends to this day. And it was amazing how, almost universally, we sat down for 45-minute conversations. The discourse was one thing, but the evidence that they were providing was that they'd made lots of really spontaneous chance encounters with people that they wouldn't have met in a bar or a park, that they met on an app because the risks were lower. The chance of happenstance was actually greater because they could do it safely from their bed or on the train. Or so I think there's a real ambivalence there.
There's a question from Matt Thompson. I don't know if you want to say it out loud, but who's kind of asking that whilst undoubtedly socially valuable, is it not minimalist, kind of privileged view of care to associate it with happenstance? I suppose, what is the relationship between that kind of those networks of care? And I suppose there is always like a romanticization of this kind of mutual network, mutual aid. I mean, I'm a part of a kind of a local group, but that happens on WhatsApp. Again, it happens on technology, and actually it kind of, the technology messes up a lot of that that dynamic. So I suppose, is anyone that would like to respond to Matt's question?
I think in the places that we were looking at, there was a lot of caring and a lot of carers taking place. It was slightly different from happenstance, but it was choosing to care for people, young children, adult carers, care for yourself, quite a lot of self-care happening. That's slightly different from the kind of happenstance thing, but I wondered, I think, for example, the older Nepali elders, as they kind of became known in Woolwich, they cared for each other and kind of understood how their relationship with kind of unknown others who they couldn't actually speak for was still kind of something to do with their place here and how they could feel a sense of belonging. I mean, I think also, just picking up on what Matthew and Reagan were saying, was about kind of intensity and what sort of intensity you allow to happen to you in public space and how much you want intensity to happen to you. So where you choose to put yourself in a square or in a park, and the kind of contrast between the two places we look at as somewhere that was kind of reasonably intense, but still, not necessarily needing to talk to people. I think that's quite important about public space, the generally not needing to talk to people, but being open to it if it could happen. So I don't know, I think sometimes that kind of idea of intensity can be helpful in thinking about loneliness as well, and isolation is kind of knowing how much you want, and there's aspects of safety in there as well, safety for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of come in there, that I think that there is that kind of sense that care should be readily available, and it's, care is very much kind of neoliberal at the moment, so there is only a certain amount distributed at certain times. It's unlikely that that's going to do everything, especially if you live on your own, if you're only lonely. And actually those care workers are probably often lonely themselves, doing lonely work, and perhaps need these encounters on the way to work, and that's part of what makes the kind of job livable. And actually, and I suppose it also brings us back to this question of risk, because that is, all of those kind of encounters feel to me like those moments that are made possible by, I mean, it's interesting that all these kind of talks have been around, well, I suppose less Reagan's, but Matt's and Claire's around London as a kind of city, and the possibilities of kind of encounter, and that's kind of what draws someone to a city. I suppose I open my kind of talk, or I closed the opening of my talk by saying, you know, that it has been the space for kind of political, kind of communal, sexual, kind of dissident energy, and actually it's brought all these different communities together. And so, and part of that is happenstance, but also the possibility of kind of organising together. Fred Cooper, who's had to go, has asked whether a bench counts as a technology or not, which I suppose that it's still part of the real world. I realised that I've strayed from a question. Does anyone want to talk back to any of that yet, Matt?
Yeah, I've just got, it's a really interesting question from Matt, or maybe it's Abby, I'm not sure. The idea of, I'm not trying to kind of exhaust the idea of care by tying it to happenstance. I'm not trying to say that that's the only way in which care happens. And I'm not trying to say either that happenstance doesn't result in things which look incredibly uncaring, and frequently does. I mean, the myth of the dangerous city is not entirely an ideological construct. But just in my experience of lockdown, as someone who lives on their own, I have become, you know, profoundly attuned and sensitized to the kind of very complex kind of array of forms of interaction, which actually count of micro kind of forms of care, which actually they constitute the city as it normally functions. You know, the city is another technology, and in some ways you could think of it as a technology of producing these kind of, you know, microscopic instances of care to strangers. Whenever anyone gets public transport, the kinds of ways in which bodies interact in that space are caring of each other. You know, the things that care is as much about a caring eye, which is watching for people before they fall over, as much as it is rushing over to pick them up. So there's kinds of levels of care which are associated with being together in the city, which are incredibly pervasive, and so pervasive they are not recognized as such. And we're living in a discourse which makes care seem quite unusual, and as a result puts up with it being contained in all sorts of ways that I think have profoundly damaged people who are, as I said, invisibilized at the margins during this very strange period of lockdown. I think there's a hell of a lot of care that hasn't happened and continues not to happen. And who knows what the damage is. We will find out in a few months' time, I imagine.
Matt said more articulately what I was thinking about, the question of whether a bench counts as a technology. And I was just thinking what to me, Claire's video just was a good demonstration and reminder of the ways that you know, benches give a reason to sit, a permission to linger, an invitation to be doing nothing or doing very little. And I think in cities that have had their benches stripped out, and also things like, you know, public toilets and working playgrounds and you know, basic facilities, public infrastructures that for urban planners and designers to insist on benches and to insist on a basic public infrastructure, that is a kind of a minimal landscape of care that isn't unimportant, or that, you know, might do a lot more to facilitate, I don't know, ideas of the good city, or ideas of comfort and care that go a lot further than ideas that seek to engineer sociality or other forms of, you know, cohesion, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And to tie back to the kind of question of loneliness, that actually, you know, you can go through the city as a lonely person, and to tie it back to kind of literature and culture as this kind of flaneur figure, but once you're isolated, all of those kind of possibilities are cut off. And so I think we really need to kind of think about, you know, what, I suppose, what's at stake in not having access to this kind of world. And it's interesting because I hadn't kind of thought about, I hadn't framed it in my head before in so much in terms of chance, but it is, in, you know, letting the unknown constantly in, which again ties us back to the pandemic and what's at stake in constantly fearing, I suppose, this kind of the vectors of infection.
It also sort of links back, I don't know what's happened in different parts of the country, but when the benches were kind of taped off during early lockdown, again, like that, I didn't have parks closed around my way, and it made you, and this kind of discourse about exercise rather than recreation. And actually it's a very ableist thing to say that you have to walk, because actually, I mean, a lot of the people in our film were there for sort of 3, 4, 5 hours. You can't walk around for that length of time. So to be able to sit somewhere in moderate comfort, ideally with a toilet nearby, is really important in terms of equality. One really nice thing was the benches in this square in Woolwich were pretty well designed in many ways, but they were granite and they were really cold. And I don't know if you saw right at the end of the film that the Nepali women, they got newspapers and they sat on them, and they'd actually sometimes get packaging from the local market, the market stalls, and they would sit underneath their sort of saris. They had these newspapers to sort of make sure they didn't get such cold bums. So that kind of just really basic technologies, I would say, about how the material relates to the human body is really important. And it is actually about how long you are able to spend time outside. And by spending time outside for longer, then you become more attuned to what's going on in your local neighborhood, and you're able to see who else is here and also be seen. And actually being seen, again, call back to COVID, is important. We all need to feel that we're seen, and spending time outside allows us to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great kind of place to bring it back to this question of recognition. It's not only the encounters of being seen. What does it mean to go, especially if you live alone, to go through the day not being seen? And occasionally we're online, but it's not quite the same dynamics of recognition. And I think that can probably do a lot of wear and tear to a person day in, day out. Any final questions amongst the speakers, amongst the audience? I know, Julia. Comments?
Eleanor.
Eleanor. I'm really interested in how urban public spaces are often haunted by the rural, which was implied, touched on, I think, in your brilliant presentations. Bella's memories of Devon, for example. Could any of you say more about this? Thanks, Eleanor.
I'll have a go to begin with, because I was born in Devon, and I clearly have hankerings after the rural written into my very urban habitus, nonetheless. Well, I suppose one of the things that is interesting about Bella's sort of memory of the rural is precisely of a world that doesn't have railings. And I sort of feel like there's a kind of the film is deeply conscious of what this particular urban technology is doing because of its removal, and it's a really charged political concept. There's a 1942 propaganda film that I have somewhere that I won't share with you because it's a waste of time, but it basically talks about the removal of the railings precisely in the terms of being able to reconnect children with a kind of nature that countryside children have. And of course, this is an age in which evacuation is also bringing up ideas of children in the countryside and all of that. So I don't know, that's kind of really 1940s stuff. But yeah, I haven't really thought about how to theorize that in the present. Does anyone have any ideas?
I think the interesting thing about railings is they try to really define what's happening where and be very, very clear about it. And a bit of clarity can be really helpful for many people, especially if you're worried about safety. But actually public space often functions in really overlapping ways. And as designers and managers of public space, what you're often doing is just trying to help that process of how people overlap. And so railings kind of work against that, though at least you can see through them, which is kind of visual permeability is actually really important. Yeah, the rural is an interesting question. I'm not sure, but I do think that these are very, so for example, the Woolwich Square, people always refer to it as a park, whereas as a landscape architect, I'd talk about it as a square, but they all refer to it as a park. Whereas St Helier's open space was always never referred to as a park. It was an open space, and then you got that nice history for Peggy remembering when she first came in, it was fields. And so, and the kind of ideas of nature that came through in those two highly designed managed landscapes was still quite pertinent. So I think people are very kind of fluid in the ways in which open spaces and nature in cities evoke memories. And railings are kind of the opposite of that, I guess, but they kind of are there to give a kind of sense of clarity, and sometimes that's useful and often it's not, I would say.
We've got 2 more questions on railings. One, living in a rural environment, I've noticed that as people have moved out of the urban areas, they've insisted on putting up fences or walls. There's a perceived danger in the countryside. Do you think railings will ever be removed? And the second one, again from Matt, is what are the parallels between Victorian railings and those of contemporary lockdown mania for the future of public space and urban encounter? A small question there for you.
Yeah, I don't know how to tackle that. I mean, yeah, I would say, like many things today, the neoliberalization of space in some ways echoes liberalism 1.0, and there are interesting kind of parallels, I think, between creeping kind of privatization of space in cities through other means, normally surveillance cameras. So one of the things about the 19th century technology of railings that ties into stuff that Jess was talking about earlier is that unlike walls, they allow for surveillance. They have a kind of they allow for a kind of generalized, dispersed kind of urban panopticism. Because people can see through them to find out what's going on inside or see out of them. And there's a kind of neoliberal new version of that, which is in surveillance cameras and other kind of means of keeping tabs on people, possibly also GPS. Yeah, I'm trying to kind of, I'm kind of interested particularly also in why Victorian railings are still with us despite their supersession by other kind of technological kind of means. And I think they serve some interesting ideological functions. They have a kind of heritage industry kind of role that sort of covertly sort of reinscribes Victorian values into the city, even when it's no longer necessary to use Victorian technologies to get the ends of a kind of ideology. So yeah, Francis Alice is excellent.
Just to come in there, I think that what's so excellent about Gaslight and your reading of it is the kind of parallels between the kind of gaslighting that happens inside the home and then in the railings in the square itself, that there's these kind of parallels naturally, that there isn't this sharp division, that kind of house and that and the railed kind of enclosure are very much kind of working in tandem with each other. And then you've got the kind of Punch and Judy is that kind of, I suppose, the children being kind of part on the outside of those railings. And, you know, it's a fascinating kind of cinematic architecture and such a great allegory for this moment in many ways. Anyone to come back to or the subject of railings or any further questions? No? Great. Well, I think, yes, we're just getting thanks. So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone. They were 3 fascinating presentations, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and I feel, you know, that they've kind of feed into each other in lots of very interesting ways. Our next event is on the 4th of March on loneliness and psychoanalysis. And I hope that you will be able to join us again. Then it just bears saying, once again, thanks to Becky, but also that I'm hoping another occasion to be able to invite you for a drink in real life and for real life encounters. To continue, but yes, if for those of you who are still around, if we can give the speakers a round of applause, I will. You unmute yourselves. As you can see from the comments, that there's one from Michael, excellent presentations note, was Britain's first professor of film at the UCL. It's all the world of Bloomsbury is very close and very prescient. Yes, exactly. So everyone is very. I think that they're all just a stream of thanks. So yes, which I want to kind of reiterate, and yes. Thank you. Any further thoughts or comments?
Thank you, Jess, for having us, and I hope all the rest of the evenings go as well. Really good.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. And it looks like a fantastic series, so I'm looking forward to hearing.
Yeah.
Iterations.
I'll be dropping in because some of them look just fantastic. So thanks for.
Great. Yes. Well, I will send around kind of links and also the recording. I know that there was a certain amount of kind of echoing at the beginning, but I hope that the recording will be good. And yes, I think that it hopefully will, open up new kind of potential collaborations. I think it's a really kind of pressing subject, and I'm glad that the kind of the benches and the apps and the railings kind of were able to speak to them in such interesting ways. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Jess.
Bye.